The river was silent under the winter snow, except for the constant murmur of water rushing beneath the ice. Deep below the surface, where the sunlight could only faintly pierce through the drifting layers of frost, life was quietly beginning. The riverbed was lined with smooth, rounded stones polished by centuries of current, and among them lay hundreds of tiny golden orbs, glistening like scattered treasure in the dim light. These were salmon eggs, fragile, translucent spheres, no bigger than a fingernail, each holding a spark of life. The mother salmon had buried them deep in a small hollow she carved with her tail, a nest known as a red. She had chosen this very spot with deliberate care. The current here was gentle but steady, carrying just enough oxygen-rich water to bathe the eggs without washing them away. The gravel protected them from debris, predators, and the sharp bite of the cold. It was her final gift, for she would never live to see them hatch. Each egg pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as a heartbeat quickened within. Inside, the embryos were curled and motionless, yet their tiny eyes were already forming, faint black specks in a sea of orange yolk. The yolk was both cradle and sustenance, a self-contained store of nutrients that would feed them until they could swim and fend for themselves. Outside their hidden chamber, the river was both guardian and threat. The steady flow brought life-giving oxygen, but also carried with it dangers, shifting stones, sudden floods, and the icy claws of winter. In the stillness of the water, shadows passed, the probing snouts of trout, the long legs of wading birds, searching for any exposed meal. But for now, the eggs lay safe, shielded by their stony fortress. Weeks passed. The snow melted slowly from the mountains upstream, sending trickles of meltwater into the river. The temperature began to rise by the smallest degree, and with it, life inside the eggs stirred. The tiny salmon, now called 11s, began to move, twitching as if awakening from a long dream. Their eyes grew darker, their bodies more defined, delicate fins forming like transparent veils, tails quivering in test movements. Finally, one crisp morning, the first egg split. Alevon spilled into the water, wriggling free from the broken shell. Its body was soft and fragile, its head outsized compared to its thin tail. The yolk sac still clung to its underside, a vital reserve of food that would sustain it for several more days. One by one, more eggs hatched. Soon the gravel was alive with tiny, flickering movements as dozens of young salmon emerged, instinctively staying close to the riverbed to avoid the swift current above. For these newborns, the world was a confusing blur of light and movement. The stones loomed like boulders, the grains of sand like mountains. Every shift in current, every shadow overhead, was a potential danger, yet there was also safety here, in the shelter of the riverbed. In this hidden nursery, they would grow stronger, their bodies learning the rhythm of the water, their instincts sharpening. In the stillness of night, when moonlight silvered the river's surface, the 11s rested between the stones, their tiny hearts beating in unison with the current. They were unaware of the vast journey ahead, unaware that their lives would carry them to the endless ocean and then, against all odds, back again. For now, their world was small, a world of cold water, shifting gravel, and the faint pulse of life that had begun with their mother's final act of love. And so the first chapter of the Salmoness epic began, not with a leap through roaring rapids or a battle against predators, but in the quiet cradle of the riverbed, where survival depended on the warmth of the stones, the purity of the water, and the instinctive will to live. The first rays of spring sunlight pierced the river's icy skin, scattering diamonds across the rippling surface. Beneath, the once frigid current had warmed just enough to stir new urgency in the young salmon. Their yolk sacs, once full and golden, were now shrunken, nearly spent. The time had come to leave the safety of the gravel nest. One by one, the fry emerged from between the stones, blinking against the shimmering light filtering from above. Their bodies were longer now, shimmering silver with faint blue-green backs that blended perfectly with the pebbled riverbed. Instinct urged them upstream no longer. Instead, the pull was downstream, toward the unknown. The river's current, gentle in the nesting grounds, grew faster as they ventured into deeper channels. Here, the world opened up. Water sang over rocks and logs, creating swirling eddies that tugged at their small bodies. The fry learned quickly to dart into pockets of calm behind stones, using them as havens from the relentless push of the current. Every flick of their tails was a lesson in balance between conserving strength and keeping pace. Above, life bustled in dangerous beauty. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, their wings catching the sunlight like shards of glass. Kingfishers perched on overhanging branches, eyes sharp and beaks poised for a sudden dive. The fry knew nothing of the concept of predators, only the instinct to vanish into shadow whenever a passing shape darkened the water. Days turned to weeks, and the fry grew stronger. Their muscles thickened, their reflexes sharpened. They hunted now, not the fierce predators they would one day become, but nimble hunters of tiny invertebrates and drifting plankton. Every successful snap at a morsel of food was fuel for the journey ahead, but danger was never far. One afternoon, the river shuddered as the shadow of a heron swept across the water. In a blink, its long beak speared down, piercing the surface with surgical precision. A fry disappeared in a splashless strike, gone before the others could scatter. Fear surged through the survivors, and they darted into the safety of a submerged root system, their tiny hearts pounding. As spring deepened into early summer, the current carried the young salmon further downstream. The smell of the water began to change, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Faint traces of salt mixed with the crisp scent of mountain snowmelt. The river widened, its banks flattening, the once icy water warming and slowing as it wound toward its destiny. They reached the estuary, a world between worlds, where fresh water mingled with the sea. Here, the fry faced the most delicate transition of their young lives. Their bodies, finely tuned to fresh water, began the slow transformation to tolerate salt water. This metamorphosis, called smoltification, would determine their survival in the ocean. Scales thickened, turning a brighter silver that glinted in the estuary's shifting light. Their gills adapted, learning to flush salt instead of conserving it. The estuary was a place of abundance but also of peril. Shoals of baitfish shimmered like liquid mirrors, attracting flocks of gulls that screamed overhead. Crabs scuttled along the muddy shallows, ready to snap at any unwary swimmer. The young salmon moved in schools now, safety in numbers, darting together as if choreographed by an unseen conductor. Some nights, the estuary was so still that the water reflected the stars as if they had spilled into the sea. The smolts rested in the dark, bodies hovering just above the silt, their sides glowing faintly in the moonlight. They could feel the call of the ocean in the faint tug of the tide, an ancient rhythm older than memory. Then came the day when the tide rose higher than usual, the pull toward the open sea irresistible. The school gathered near the mouth of the river, their bodies vibrating with restless energy. The salt tanks grew stronger with every heartbeat. One bold smolt surged forward into the unknown, and like a wave breaking free, the rest followed. They spilled into the ocean, a world without boundaries. The water was deeper than anything they had ever known, its color shifting from green to an endless blue. The current here was stronger, the waves heavier, the space infinite. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet exhilarating. They swam together, their silver sides flashing in the sunlight that streamed down from above. The river was gone behind them now, hidden in the haze of their journey. Before them stretched years of survival in the vast, unforgiving ocean. Here, they would grow into the powerful adults they were destined to become. But somewhere deep within, imprinted in their very bones, was the memory of the scent of their birthplace, a map they would one day follow home. And so began the second act of their lives, a voyage into the heart of the sea, where every day would be a test of strength, cunning, and endurance. For the young salmon, the open waters promised both the fullness of life and the certainty of peril. Years passed in the vast blue wilderness. The salmon, once fragile fry, had transformed into sleek, powerful hunters. Their bodies, now heavy with muscle, shimmered with a metallic sheen, silver flanks catching the sunlight, dark backs blending into the depths. They had learned the ocean's many faces, the glassy calm of summer mornings, the heaving grey swells of winter storms, and the riot of life that thrived beneath the surface. In the early years, they stayed close to the coastline, chasing schools of anchovies and herring. With time, they ventured farther, their journeys carrying them hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers into the open sea. Here, the water was darker, colder, and the horizon unbroken. They followed the invisible highways of ocean currents, riding their strength to places they had never known existed. Life in the ocean was rich but merciless. They hunted with precision, mouths snapping shut on shimmering prey, but every meal was earned through constant vigilance. Shadows loomed in the deep, predators of staggering size, orcas whose haunting calls vibrated through the water. sea lions that struck with explosive speed, and sharks whose eyes gave away nothing before the kill. The salmon's life became a balance of feast and flight, of seizing opportunity and evading death. They grew larger, stronger, more resilient with each passing season. For a time, it seemed as if this endless ocean would be their forever home. And then, without warning, it began. The call. It was not a sound, nor a voice. It was a pull, deep in the marrow of their bones, ancient and undeniable. It began as a faint stirring, like the memory of a scent carried on a breeze. The salmon did not question it. They could not. This was the memory of home, etched into their very DNA. No matter how far they had traveled, they could find it again. Slowly, they began to turn. Their sleek bodies angled toward a direction they had not consciously chosen. Day by day, their course shifted, no longer following the rhythms of prey or the whim of currents, but steering toward something constant, something absolute. The journey home had begun. The ocean, which had once seemed boundless, now felt like an obstacle. The salmon swam with purpose, weaving through kelp forests, gliding past rocky headlands, and crossing vast stretches of open water. Along the way, they re-entered territories they had once explored as juveniles. Many had been rich hunting grounds, but now they offered little more than brief rest. The urgency of the call was stronger than hunger. As they approached the coastline, the water grew shallower, the light brighter. The smell of the river, faint at first, began to touch their senses. To humans, it would have been imperceptible, but to the salmon, it was a beacon, a unique chemical fingerprint, the exact signature of the river where they had been born. It was as if each molecule of water whispered their origin. But the way home was not without cost. By instinct, they stopped feeding. Their bodies began to change in preparation for the fresh water ahead. In the ocean, their silver sides had been armor against predators. Now their colors shifted. Males grew darker, their jaws elongating into fierce hooks called kypes. Females swelled with a precious cargo of eggs. The ocean's embrace loosened behind them as they surged into the estuary, where salt water and fresh water mingled. This was the threshold, the first and most delicate test. Their gills worked tirelessly to adjust to the absence of salt. Their hearts beat faster, their muscles burned, but they pressed forward. In the estuary, dangers waited. Seals hunted here, knowing the salmon would pass through in numbers. Gulls wheeled overhead, shrieking. The current pushed against them now, no longer carrying them forward, but resisting their passage. Still, they moved on, each beat of their tails a promise to the place that had called them back. When they finally crossed into the pure fresh water of their natal river, the transformation was complete. They were no longer creatures of the sea, but warriors of the current. Every stone beneath them, every bend in the river, felt both strange and familiar, the echoes of a place they had known in the first moments of life. The river greeted them not as the gentle cradle of their birth, but as a gauntlet. The water here was colder, swifter, more relentless than they remembered. Yet the salmon did not slow. Ahead lay rapids, waterfalls, predators, and the final chapter of their existence. But the call was louder now than ever, resonating through every muscle, every breath. They would not, they could not, turn back. This was more than instinct. This was destiny. The river no longer welcomed them. It challenged, tested, and sought to break them. The current, once a guiding hand in their youth, had transformed into a roaring wall of white water. From bank to bank, the river thrashed itself against boulders the size of houses, churning into froth that hissed and roared like a living beast. The salmon hovered in the calmer water below the first set of rapids, their bodies trembling not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of what lay ahead. For a moment, they rested in a swirling eddy, tails sweeping gently to hold position. Each one could feel the river's pulse through their lateral lines, a constant vibration, a language of currents, turbulence, and hidden pathways. Somewhere in that chaos was the route forward, and they would have to read it the way their ancestors had for thousands of years. The first ascent, a dominant male, his jaw hooked into a formidable kype, lunged first. His silver had long since given way to dark crimson and olive green, the battle colors of the spawning run. He slipped out of the eddy, aimed toward a seam in the current, and with a whip of his tail, launched himself forward. The river seized him instantly, shoving his body sideways. He twisted, cut across the current, and found shelter behind a jagged rock where the water softened for just a heartbeat. One by one, the others followed. Each leap was a gamble, Missing by half a second could mean being thrown back into the pool below or slammed into a rock face, their bodies arched in the air, fins flaring for balance, droplets flying like shattered glass. For the briefest moment, they seemed to fly. Then gravity reclaimed them, and they slapped against the water, either advancing or falling back. Some fell. A female heavy with eggs misjudged her leap and was thrown into a swirling hydraulic. The water spun her like a leaf in the wind. She vanished in a cloud of bubbles before breaking free downstream, her flanks scraped raw by stone. Still, she circled back. There was no retreat. The physics of survival, the rapids demanded precision without hesitation. The salmon read the tongues of water, narrow slick corridors that flowed fastest through the chaos, and used them as launch pads. They aimed for pillows where the current bulged against a boulder, using the lift to gain height. They searched for seams, those invisible borders where fast and slow water met, giving just enough advantage to slip forward without being thrown sideways. Rest was fleeting. They clung to back at ease, no bigger than their own length, muscles shivering from exertion. Their gills flared wide, pumping oxygen into blood already burning with lactic acid. The journey upstream was no longer just a migration. It had become open warfare between muscle and water, determination and exhaustion. The waterfall, the next obstacle, rose before them with the voice of thunder. A sheet of water hurled itself from a rocky lip into the plunge pool below, hammering it with such force that the spray hung in the air like drifting smoke. At the base, the salmon gathered, circling in the calmer water along the edges, their eyes locked on the point above where the fall curled back on itself, the only possible passage. A female flushed bright red coiled her body like a drawn bow and shot upward. She broke through the curtain of water, but the timing was wrong. The returning pulse slammed her back down. She vanished in the white seconds later. She reappeared below, battered but alive. Without pause, she circled again, recovered in a side eddy, and tried once more. On the fourth attempt, she struck the perfect moment. The waterfall's fury slackened for a fraction of a second, and she slipped over the lip into the quieter water beyond. She was gone from sight, but her success was a signal. The path could be conquered. Predators in waiting. The rapids were not the only threat. Along the banks, an osprey hung motionless in the air, its wings beating in slow, powerful strokes. With a sudden drop, it speared the surface, vanishing in a burst of spray, and emerging with a writhing salmon in its talons. The rest of the fish scattered into shadows beneath overhanging logs and roots, holding still until the danger passed. Further upstream, in the shallows near a narrow chute, an otter slipped through the water like liquid muscle. It darted between boulders, jaws snapping, scattering the smaller males that were already weakened from the climb. Each predator knew the salmon would pass here. The gauntlet was as much about surviving these ambushes as it was about the current itself. The man-made wall, and then they reached the dam. Concrete, unyielding, stretched across the valley like a scar. The main spillway was death, a torrent of white that no living thing could climb. To one side, however, ran a fish ladder, a staircase of pools linked by short drops. It was salvation, but not without cost. The ladder concentrated the salmon into a narrow corridor where predators had learned to wait. Minks slinked along the rocks, gulls wheeled above, and any moment of weakness could mean the end. Each leap between pools was as punishing as any rapid. Some made it in bursts of strength and precision. Others failed, falling back into the lower pool, only to try again, sometimes 2, 3, even 10 times before success. One female, her scales dulled, her fins frayed, reached the 5th pool and stalled. Her tail beat furiously, but her strength was nearly gone. For long seconds she hung there, head just below the lip, refusing to surrender. At last, with one final surge, she slid into the 6th pool, her body shaking but her eyes fixed on the flow ahead. The basin beyond, above the dam, the river widened into a quiet basin, the water smooth and glassy after the violence below. Here the salmon floated, letting the current wash over them. They were not resting out of luxury, only regathering the strength needed for the miles yet to come. Their bodies bore the marks of the climb, torn fins, missing scales, patches of fungus blooming on old wounds. From upstream came a faint but familiar scent, carried on the water like a memory whispered across years. It was the smell of the gravel bed where they had been born. Their birthplace was close. The hardest gauntlet was behind them, but the river was not done with its trials. Ahead, The current bent into a shadowed gorge, the sound of another rapid echoing between stone walls. Without hesitation, the salmon formed a loose line and swam forward, their battered bodies moving with the same unwavering resolve that had carried them from the sea to this moment. They had survived the gauntlet, but the true test, the final climb to life's purpose, still awaited. The basin's glassy calm was deceptive. Here, the river whispered instead of roared, its voice soft after the deafening rapids. The salmon drifted forward, fins slicing the still water in slow, measured strokes. But tranquility in a wild river is never absolute. Danger thrives in the quiet as much as in the chaos. The watchers from above, high in the cool morning sky, an osprey circled, its dark eyes scanning the mirrored surface for the faintest flicker of silver. The salmon below sensed the shadow passing over them, their bodies tightening, tails dipping to sink just a little deeper. The osprey hovered, wings beating in slow, deliberate rhythm. Then, with a sudden tuck and dive, it plummeted, talons extended like curved knives. The strike was surgical. The bird erupted from the surface with a salmon clutched in its grasp, droplets cascading from the writhing fish as it fought in vain. The rest of the school scattered into the darker water near the basin's edge. Pressing close to the safety of submerged logs and overhanging roots, they held still, letting their colors blend with the dappled light until the predator's shadow drifted away. The silent swimmer predators in the water were more insidious. The first sign of the otter was not sight, but a ripple, a subtle disturbance in the reflection of the overhanging willows. It moved with fluid efficiency, weaving between the shadows, its small eyes scanning for weakness. The otter was no threat to the stronger salmon. It sought the weary, the wounded, the ones whose leaps over the gauntlet had cost too much. A male with a torn dorsal fin lagged behind the group, his movements sluggish, his flanks pale where scales had been scraped away. The otter's head broke the surface briefly, just enough to fix its target. Before it slipped under again, the water erupted in a flash of silver and brown. A struggle churned the surface, but it was brief. The predator dragged its prize into the reeds, leaving a thin trail of scales drifting downstream. The human shadow, the salmon, knew nothing of nets or lines until they met them. Where the river widened into a slow glide, dark shapes lay just beneath the surface. Mesh curtains anchored to stakes driven into the gravel. They were not part of nature's rhythm. They were human-made. The salmon pressed toward the center channel, sensing the invisible wall ahead. Some slipped past through narrow gaps. Others were less fortunate, bodies thrashing as they tangled in the mesh, their struggles drawing more fish toward the hazard. From the bank, a figure approached, a fisherman, boots sinking into the silt. With practiced motions, he lifted the net, heavy with life. Water poured from it in silver streams. The trapped salmon flailed, their bodies slapping against each other, scales glinting in the sun. Some would never reach their spawning grounds, their journey ending here, claimed not by bear or bird, but by human hands. The shadow in the deep further upstream, where the water darkened into a deep bend, the largest predator of all waited. The salmon sensed it before they saw it, a shift in the current's flow, a pressure change that whispered of danger. Then, from the shadows, the shape emerged, a bear, chest deep in the current, massive paws poised above the surface. Its eyes tracked the shimmering forms moving just beyond reach. The first salmon leaped instinctively, trying to clear the shallows and avoid the bear's striking zone. The bear's paw swept through the air with terrifying speed, claws slicing the water. A fish was snared mid-leap, flung onto the bank in a spray of droplets. The bear followed, jaws closing on the wriggling body, the sound of tearing flesh mingling with the hiss of the river. The survivors pressed harder upstream, the current now a lesser threat compared to the gauntlet of predators at every turn. A relentless climb for every stretch of open water. There was another ambush. Eagles perched in the dead trees along the banks, launching sudden dives that cut the air with a whistle. Mink darted along the shoreline, disappearing and reappearing like shadows made flesh. Even beneath the surface, danger prowled. Larger trout and pike lay in wait, ready to snatch the smaller salmon smolts that had joined the migration early. Yet, the salmon pressed on. Each predator claimed some, but the rest swam harder, driven by a compulsion older than fear. Their bodies, though battered, carried reserves of strength hidden in muscle and will. Hunger gnawed at them. They had not eaten since leaving the ocean, but the call of their birthplace was stronger than any need for food. The cost of the journey. By the time the sun dipped low, the survivors bore the marks of the day's trials. Torn fins fluttered like tattered flags. Scrapes from rocks and teeth marred their flanks. Fungus bloomed in pale patches on older wounds. Yet in their eyes, dark, unblinking, unwavering, there was no hint of surrender. The river narrowed ahead, the sound of another rapid building in the cool evening air. The predators of the basin and the banks would be left behind here. But new challenges waited in the next stretch. Swifter currents, higher falls, colder water. The salmon gathered in the slow water below the next climb, their bodies holding steady in the push of the current. They had survived the basin's hunters. Now the river itself would resume its assault, and with every beat of their tails, they moved closer to the place where life had begun, and where it would end. The river had grown colder, not the crisp chill of spring melt, but a deeper, sharper cold, the kind that seeped into muscle and bone, slowing even the strongest strokes. The salmon felt it in every movement now. Their bodies, which had carried them from the vastness of the ocean to this narrow ribbon of water, were starting to betray them. The first signs of decay. Flesh that had once been taut with ocean-fed strength was softening. Scales loosened from their sockets, flaking away with each scrape against the rocks. The sleek silver armor they had worn at sea had long since dulled into dark, spawning colors, crimson flanks, olive backs, but now those colors began to blotch, fading at the edges. Their mouths, especially the male's hooked kypes, were worn from battering stone and wood. Some had teeth chipped or missing entirely. The soft tissue around their jaws was ragged, split from the strain of fighting the current. The most telling sign of all was the fungus, pale, cottony blooms, sprouting from old wounds. It clung to fins torn in the rapids, two flanks where predators' claws had raked, two patches of skin rubbed raw by unyielding stone. The salmon ignored it. They had no energy to waste on what could not be undone. Starvation's grip they had not eaten since leaving the salt water. The fat reserves stored in their bodies were dwindling with each mile upstream. Muscle mass was being consumed now, burned as fuel for the climb. Their bodies were thinner, heads appearing almost too large for their frames. Still, the instinct to feed had shut down entirely. A drifting insect or small fish passed within reach, and not one salmon made a move to snap at it. All their energy was fixed on a single purpose: to reach the gravel beds where life had begun. The paradox was cruel. The closer they came to fulfilling their purpose, the more their bodies unraveled. The endless current, the gradient of the river, steepened again. Rapids churned, white and loud, the sound filling the gorge so completely it seemed to live inside the skull. Each leap was harder than the one before. Their muscles burned within seconds, gills flared wide to gulp oxygen in the thin, turbulent water. Some found refuge in the shadows behind rocks, resting just long enough to slow their hammering hearts. Others pressed forward without pause, knowing that to stop too long was to risk never starting again. The river was littered with the bodies of those who hadn't made it, pale shapes lodged against stones, their eyes clouded. Their journey ended midstream. The living swam past without hesitation. There was no room for grief here. Every beat of the current was a reminder that time was running out. Fights in the current. The closer they came to the spawning grounds, the more aggressive the males became. In narrow channels, they rammed each other with blunt force, mouths wide, teeth snapping at flanks. A victorious male would hold his position, defending it against all comers, even if the fight drained what little strength he had left. Females, heavy with eggs, endured these battles silently, slipping through the chaos to preserve their energy for what lay ahead. The cliff of water late in the day, they reached a waterfall that seemed impossibly high, a sheer drop, where the river leaped free of the earth and crashed into a boiling pool below. Mist rose in a constant cloud, and the air smelled of wet stone and cold iron. They circled in the pool, reading the fall, feeling for the moment when its force eased just enough to allow passage. The pool itself was a trap. Its swirling currents pinned the weak against the rocks, sapping what little strength they had left. A male, his back scarred from a bear's swipe, coiled his body and launched himself upward. For a moment, he hung in the air, tail whipping, droplets catching the light like shards of glass. Then the fall caught him, hammered him down, and sent him tumbling back into the pool. He tried again, and again. The third time, he found the seam, a narrow slip of current that lifted instead of crushed, and vanished over the lip into the world above. Others followed, some succeeding, some failing until they could try no more. Nightfall in the river. When darkness came, the cold deepened. The salmon rested where they could, behind logs, in the lee of boulders, in narrow pockets of calm. The river sang differently at night, its voice softer, less urgent, as if acknowledging the day's trials. But the climb was not done. Tomorrow, the current would take again. Tomorrow, the toll would grow higher. They did not know how many days remained to them, nor how many more obstacles lay ahead. They only knew that the river's scent, their birth scent, was stronger now, threading through every breath, guiding them ever upward. Their bodies were failing. Their purpose was not. Morning came pale and cold, the sun a weak disk smudged behind mist that clung to the river like ghostly breath. The salmon hovered in a slow, swirling eddy, their battered bodies rocking gently in the pull of the current. The scent of their birthplace, sharp, mineral-rich, unique to the exact stretch of gravel where they had emerged years ago, now pulsed through the water in steady waves. It was no longer a whisper, no longer a faint trace to be followed on faith. It was a chord wound deep into their bones, drawing them forward with an urgency beyond choice. Ahead, the gorge tightened. Granite walls rose on either side, slick and black with constant spray. The river, squeezed by stone, gathered itself into something harder, faster, and more dangerous than before. The roar grew with every body length they advanced, until it filled their skulls like a drumbeat. Here, the journey would not be about endurance alone. It would be about precision, timing, and the last reserves of strength they had left. Shallow strain. The first challenge was not the raging current, but its opposite. Shallows. The river fanned out over a broad gravel bar, the water no deeper than the width of a fin in places. To cross it, the salmon had to scrape their bellies along the stones, twisting and wriggling with every inch. Scales tore loose, flashing briefly before drifting away downstream. The friction burned, but stopping meant being stranded in a place where the water offered no lift, only weight. A female heavy with eggs rolled slightly to her side to slide through the thinnest thread of current, using her tail like a paddle to push forward. Each stroke cost her. The scarred male who had shadowed her since the rapids matched her pace, his flank brushing hers in the most subtle of protections, not to shield her from predators now, but from the unyielding press of the river itself. When they reached deeper water again, the relief was almost painful. They floated for a few moments in the shadow of an overhanging rock ledge, their gills opening wide to draw in oxygen-rich water. But the pause was brief. The pull upstream was stronger than fatigue. The logjam gate. The gorge narrowed again, and here the river was blocked by a tangled barricade of fallen trees and branches, a logjam built over years of storms and floods. Water hissed through gaps no wider than a salmon's body, each opening a possible escape or a lethal trap. The salmon fanned out, testing each passage with nose and fin. The scarred male found one where the current curled upward in a narrow seam, lifting rather than crushing. He rose into it, muscles flexing, and slipped through to the other side. Immediately he turned back into the flow, holding his position just beyond the gap, creating a pocket of calmer water for the female to follow. She hesitated only once before sliding in beside him, the two of them breaking the current together while the rest of the school pushed through, one at a time. Some misjudged. A young male shot toward a gap only to be flung back, stunned, his body rolling in the turbulence, before he righted himself and tried again. The jam gave no second chances without effort. Each passage was paid for in energy the salmon could not afford to waste. The tunnel of steel beyond the logjam lay a relic of human intervention, a rust-dark culvert embedded in the bank, funneling the river through a round steel throat. The pipe's corrugated ridges rattled the flow into a rhythm, rib, 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 that the salmon matched with their tailbeats. The tunnel magnified sound until it became a pressure in the bones, the roar ahead swelling with each body length. The female entered first, aiming for the faint darker stripe down the center, where the current was smoothest. Her belly brushed the ridges, her gills strained against the acceleration. The circle of daylight at the far end expanded until she burst free, meeting air for the briefest heartbeat before striking water again in a controlled plunge. She landed in the one pocket of calm carved by the outflow's curl. The scarred male followed, his body scraping the steel hard enough to peel scales, but his momentum carried him through. Others hesitated at the mouth, but the pair's success pulled them forward in a ripple of silver and crimson. Rain and debris. Rain began as a whisper on the surface, each drop a tiny shiver across the skin of the river. Then the sky lowered, and the whisper became a steady drum. The water darkened, thickened, and quickened. With the rain came debris, branches, leaves, and, worse, entire root systems torn free by the surge upstream. One such root ball came spinning down the gorge, its tangled mass rolling end over end. The scarred male sensed it before he saw it, a shift in the pressure along his flanks. He shoved the female sideways into a seam of slower water. Just as the root ball clipped his back, fungus and skin tore away in a cloud of pale fibers and blood. But he straightened without pause, resuming his place beside her, as if nothing had happened. The staircase, the gorge's last rise, was a staircase of bedrock ledges, each no taller than a body's length, but slick with algae and autumn's decay. Water poured up the center of each step in narrow tongues, the fastest line but also the most treacherous. The female tested one, sliding back before she reached the lip. The scarred male moved into position below her, angling his body to break the force of the current just enough for her to launch again. This time she made it, settling into the next shallow. They repeated this, him taking the brunt of the water, her using the opening, step after step, until the last ledge gave way to a quiet basin. Other salmon passed them, some with raw determination, others with the desperate speed of those running out of time. The last wall from the basin came the sound of falling water, but this was no broad cascade. It was a single clean sheet, pouring from a notch in the rock into a circular plunge pool. There was no side channel, no alternate path, only the fall itself. The female circled the pool, reading the pulse of the water. The fall had its own rhythm, strong, then slightly less strong, then strong again. The difference was invisible, but she could feel it in the way the turbulence pressed against her flanks. On a softer beat, she coiled and launched. For an instant, she was airborne, droplets scattering from her fins like sparks. She hit the lip, found the slight upward lift in the water, and was gone into the quiet above. The scarred male tried next. His first attempt failed, the fall hammering him down. He circled, breathing hard, then tried again, and this time the current relented just enough for him to slip over the edge. The cradle of life beyond the fall. The river bent into a gentle elbow, where the current slowed over a bed of clean pea gravel. The female drifted above it, testing with her tail. The stones shifted easily, letting her carve a hollow without burying the space in silt. She pressed again, sweeping in a slow, powerful rhythm until the nest was ready. The scarred male hovered downstream, guarding against shadows in the current. Around them, other salmon moved in the shallows, each seeking their own perfect place. The air was cool, the water colder, and the smell of the springs was now everything. They had crossed the ocean. They had survived the gauntlet. They had passed every predator, every wall of water, every injury the journey had inflicted. And now, they had arrived. Morning light came soft and diffused, spilling through low river mist, like liquid glass. The current in this bend was slower, calmer, the turbulence of the rapids now far behind. Here, the river spread its body over a shallow riffle of clean, rounded gravel. The water sang a quieter song, a steady silver-threaded hum that vibrated against the flanks of the fish that had fought so hard to arrive. For the female, this was the place. She had searched for hours the day before, testing each patch of riverbed the way a mason tests stones before building a wall. Too much silt, and the eggs would suffocate. Too coarse, and the water would rush through too fast. But here, the gravel shifted just enough under the sweep of her tail, the flow steady and cold, threading oxygen into every hollow space, shaping the cradle. She hovered over the chosen spot, muscles taut despite the exhaustion that had carved hollows along her once strong body. Each beat of her tail was measured and deliberate, sweeping aside small pebbles, sending a cloud of fine sand drifting downstream. The hollow, the red, began to take shape. A shallow bowl just deep enough to cradle the first generation of life she would ever lay. The scarred male kept his vigil a short distance downstream, angling his body across the current to create a pocket of calmer water for her. His own journey had been brutal, the hooked jaw worn from striking rocks and rivals, patches of fungus blooming along an old wound, a deep scrape on his back where a root ball had struck. Yet he moved with quiet purpose, his battered body still an unyielding shield. Around them, the rest of the river carried on in ignorance. A pair of dippers bobbed along the far bank, dipping into the shallows for insect larvae. An autumn leaf, crimson and spotted, spiraled past, catching for a moment in an eddy before continuing its slow journey downstream. The first release, when the hollow was ready, the female turned to face upstream. Her flanks quivered, not from cold, but from the strain of holding position in the current and the rising urgency inside her. The scarred male slid closer, his head near her belly, his movements slow, deliberate. In a sudden, shivering motion, she released her first clutch, dozens of translucent, golden eggs spilling into the hollow, each one no bigger than a pearl, but bright as an ember in the cool light. At the same moment, the male shuddered, releasing a milky cloud that drifted over the eggs, enveloping them in a protective veil. For a few seconds, the water between them was thick with life, a gold and white haze, drifting and swirling before the current began to thin it. Beneath the eggs, settled among the pebbles, safe from the force of the flow, the female wasted no time. She pivoted and began sweeping fresh gravel over the clutch, sealing the chamber with care. Each stroke was precise, like a craftsman laying the final stones of a wall. Once covered, the eggs were nearly invisible, hidden from predators and the light. Rivals in the current, the spawning drew others. From the darker water beyond the riffle, younger males darted forward, slimmer, faster, their colors not yet fully deepened. They were sneaker males, opportunists who rushed in at the exact moment of egg release, hoping to scatter their own milt into the cloud. The scarred male met them with swift, decisive violence. He lunged sideways, jaws snapping, body twisting to slam his flank into theirs. The water boiled with their struggle for a few seconds before the intruders darted back into the shadows, leaving only drifting scales in their wake. The female had not paused, her focus never breaking from the red beneath her. A sequence of life spawning was not a single act, but a sequence, repeated again and again. She moved a body length upstream, fanned a new hollow, released another clutch, and watched the male's milt drift over them in a pale bloom. Then came the covering, the rhythmic sweep of her tail, the settling of gravel, the creation of another hidden chamber. By mid-morning she had carved a terrace of these reds, each one overlapping slightly with the next, so the current would draw fresh, oxygenated water through them all. This was instinct refined by millennia, a design shaped not by thought, but by survival. Between each release, the pair rested briefly in the calm pocket downstream. The female's breathing came heavy now, her flanks thinner, her movements slower. The scarred male's wounds bled faintly into the current, but he did not abandon his station. The chemistry beneath the stones, beneath the gravel, invisible to the eye, a transformation had begun. Each egg, its yolk, a storehouse of energy, carried a tiny point, the micropyle, where a single sperm cell could enter. Once it did, the entrance sealed, and life began dividing cell by cell. The cold of the river slowed the process, letting it unfold steadily over weeks rather than days. The river itself was a guardian now, its flow delivering oxygen, its cold keeping the eggs dormant until the right moment, the last of her strength. By afternoon, the female's movements had the pared-down grace of a creature running only on necessity. She no longer fanned gravel that would not move. Every motion was efficient, every calorie spent toward the single purpose that had driven her here. Her final release came late in the day, the eggs fewer now, but no less precious. The male's cloud was thinner too, the energy in his body nearly spent. Still, the coverage was complete, his movements steady and sure. When the last chamber was capped, the riffle's song seemed to settle, its pitch shifting subtly, as if the river itself acknowledged the work was done. The aftermath, they drifted side by side into the shallow slack water just below the spawning site. The female's belly was slack, her tail frayed from hours of sweeping gravel. The male's body was a map of scars, some fresh, some old, all earned in the service of this moment. They would not eat again, they would not heal. Their bodies were already breaking down, muscle turning to fuel for the last days of life. But the work was complete. Beneath the stones lay the future, thousands of tiny, hidden lives, each with the scent of this exact river imprinted deep within them. Come spring, when the snow melted into the mountains and swelled the river, some of those eggs would hatch into Eleven's tiny fish, with yolk sacs still attached. They would grow into fry, then smolts. Then, years later, they would follow this same invisible cord back here. And they too would climb the rapids, face the predators, and carve their own nests in the gravel. For the pair who had made it here, there would be no return to the sea. They had given everything the journey required, and then given more. Night fell over the river. The reds lay quiet, hidden from sight, but alive with potential. The female hovered over them one last time, her body trembling with exhaustion, but still aligned with the flow. The scarred male kept his place downstream, eyes fixed on the dark water beyond, guarding what they had made. Soon, the river would take them, but their story would continue, carried in the bodies of the young now sleeping under the stones, waiting for the moment when the current would call them to. The light at the bend had changed. The sharp brightness of spawning day was gone, replaced by a muted, almost metallic gleam, as if the air itself had thinned. Mist curled low over the riffle, slipping between alder trunks and dissolving into the darker water beyond. Beneath that gauze 2 figures still held their stations, not drifting, not yet gone, but reduced to the purest essence of staying. The red lay just upstream, invisible under its shell of carefully packed gravel. Beneath that roof, 1,000 small lives had begun their slow, secret work, each egg a translucent sphere wrapped in a membrane fine as breath, yolk glowing faintly in the dim. The water that passed over them was cold and clean, carrying oxygen into every tiny chamber. The female had carved and shaped this nest with the last of her strength. The scarred male had guarded it with the last of his will. Now, the river had entered its final negotiation with them. Holding the line, the female floated just above the red, her battered tail moving in small, economical beats. The brilliant crimson of her flanks had dulled. The olive along her back was blotched with pale wear. She was thinner now, her belly slack and empty of the weight it had carried for weeks. The scarred male held position just downstream, angled slightly toward her so that his body split the current and left her in a gentler seam. His jaw, hooked and worn, opened and closed slowly, gills lifting like tired shutters. Every so often a shadow drifted in from the deeper water, a curious juvenile salmon, a rival male, or the sinuous ripple of a mink swimming just below the surface. The male met each with the same quiet refusal to yield. No rushing, no wasted flares of aggression, only the steady insistence of presence, as immovable as a lodged boulder. The cold that does not lift by nightfall. The cold was no longer something to be endured. It was part of them. It pressed in from the stones, seeped up through the belly, and braided into muscle and blood. Motion slowed, breath slowed. Hunger had long since faded, replaced by a singular awareness, the pull of the current, the scent of the gravel, the position of the other fish. The moon slid into a thin break in the clouds, silvering the riffle for a moment, before slipping away again. In that pale wash of light, the female dipped lower, her belly almost brushing the roof of the red. She lingered there, as if listening for some private confirmation that the eggs were safe. The scarred male's wound, the deep scrape across his back, was pale now. The fungus that had claimed it, lifting and swaying with the water's slow rhythm, it no longer healed, it no longer hurt, it simply was. The first to let go, it happened without alarm. The female tilted slightly, her head dipping, and instead of correcting with a flick of the tail, she let herself drift an inch back into the male's seam. For a time, she held there, fins trembling faintly. Then her body rolled, almost gently, to one side. She did not fight the turn. Her gills opened wider than necessary, her mouth parted once, twice, and then the movement stopped. She hung in the water like something between waking and sleep. The current eased her backward until she settled against a low stone. There, the river began its work of carrying her away in slow degrees. Not all at once, but as it always does, patient and precise. The scarred male did not turn to look. He kept his eyes on the upstream lip of the red, on the exact seam of current he had been holding since the first egg fell into place. The days after, with the female gone, the red became both lighter and heavier. Lighter, because there was no longer a need to hold a space for two. Heavier, because all the watching was now his alone. Daylight brought scavengers. Ravens flitted down from the alder limbs to inspect the pale shape lodged in the shallows downstream. An osprey circled once, then veered away toward deeper hunting. At midday, a mink passed close enough that the male could see the glint of its wet whiskers. He lifted his body into its path, flaring his battered fins just enough to make the predator reconsider. It vanished back into shadow. The river rose slightly with new rain, darkening the water and filling it with drifting leaves. Yellow maple, curled birch, even a strip of cedar bark spiraled past. Some caught on the upstream lip of the red. He nudged them away with slow sweeps of his head. The last stand. 3 days later, he met the otter. It came up from below the bend, slick and sure, aiming straight for the red. The male struck without hesitation, ramming his hooked jaw into the predator's snout and flaring to his full width. It was not a blow that could wound deeply, not anymore, but it was enough to turn the otter aside. It vanished into the murk with a flick of its tail. The effort cost him. His breathing grew ragged, his hold on the seam less certain. Once, he slid a foot downstream before catching himself. The wound across his back bled faintly again, a pale thread that unraveled into nothing. That night, the cold deepened. His body hung lower in the water, head dipping more often. He no longer chased the small fish that drifted too close. He simply watched them pass, his dark eyes following until the current took them out of sight. The end of the watch at dawn, a faint mist clung to the surface. The male's body swayed slightly, no longer perfectly aligned with the flow. When the first light touched the gravel, he drifted backward, slow and unresisting. He rolled once in the water, his pale belly flashing in the muted sun, then settled against a tangle of roots at the bank. The red, now unguarded, lay as it had for days, an unremarkable patch of riverbed to any eye but theirs. The water kept passing over it, cold and steady, carrying oxygen into the hidden chambers. The cycle holds within the gravel. The eggs were alive. Tiny hearts had begun to form, pulsing in rhythm with the river's own ancient beat. In weeks, the embryos would stretch, eyes darkening, spines curling into shape. Come spring, when the snow melted in the high country, the young would emerge as alevins, each carrying the imprint of this place deep in their being. Some would survive to smolt stage, ride the river to the sea, and grow strong in the boundless saltwater. And years from now, they too would feel the same magnetic pull in their bones. The call to turn, to climb, to spend themselves utterly, for a future they would never see. The river did not mourn. It carried the bodies of the pair into the work of the valley, into the bellies of scavengers, into the soil beneath the alders, into the moss that clung to wet stones, and in time, into the bodies of the young that would swim here again. The sacrifice was not an ending. It was the oldest beginning the river knew. The river kept flowing, as it always had. It did not pause for grief. It did not slow for remembrance. Its voice, endless and unbroken, carried the weight of what had happened without ever naming it. The bodies of the pair who had come so far were no longer there to hold their stations. The red lay beneath its shell of gravel, its cargo hidden, quiet, alive, beneath the stones. Inside each translucent egg, a heartbeat had begun. It was too faint to feel with fingers too slow to hear, but the river felt it in the way. Water moved through the gravel bed, a soft urgency, a reason for the oxygen to linger a fraction longer before sliding away. Eyes formed first, two dark pinpoints in each small sphere, followed by a spine coiling along the yolk. Weeks would pass before they hatched, and even then they would not leave the gravel. The young alevins would carry their yolk sacs like lanterns, feeding from them until they could rise into the open current. The design was perfect in its patience. Winter would hold them safe beneath the stones. Spring's thaw would call them upward, the work of death. Upstream and down, the carcasses of other salmon lay caught in root tangles, wedged between boulders, resting in the still water of side channels. The river was never wasteful. Flesh softened and fed crayfish, caddis, larvae, and clouds of small midges that would lift into the air come summer. Eagles dropped from the sky to claim their share. Bears waded in the shallows to drag away heavy shapes, and even the forest itself took its portion. Nitrogen from the ocean seeping into the roots of alder and cedar feeding. Leaves that would one day fall back into the river. What had died here would live again in 1,000 forms, in the fur of a fox, in the wingbeats of a kingfisher, in the green flare of spring moss. The cord that pulls far out at sea, young salmon from years past, still swam. They had never seen this bend in the river, never touched the gravel of the red, and yet, in the deep architecture of their bones, they carried its scent. When the time came, they would turn each following that invisible thread back through the salt, into the brackish estuaries, into the white water, into the shadowed gorges, into the exact patch of riverbed where their own lives had begun. Not all would make it. Predators waited. Storms would rise. Nets would take some. But enough would survive to find this place again, and in finding it, they would finish the same circle that had brought the scarred male and the weary female here. Seasons passing, winter ice would come, sealing the riffle in a thin, translucent skin. Snow would lie deep on the banks, muffling the river's roar. Under the ice, the eggs would wait, untouched, the currents still breathing for them. Spring floods would sweep away debris, tumble fresh gravel over the redds, and carry insects in abundance to feed the new fry. By summer, the survivors would be darting in the shallows, flashing silver in the green light under the alders. Some would linger for a year or more, learning the rhythm of the current, the scent of the stones, before letting go and following the pull downstream to the ocean. What remains, the pair who had made the journey from the ocean, would not be remembered as individuals. No other fish would carry their image, no tree would bear their names. Their legacy was not in being remembered, it was in the living proof of their effort. It was in the eyes beginning to darken inside the eggs. It was in the chemical memory etched into the fry's bodies, telling them where home was, before they had ever left it. The river held their story the way it held the stones, not as a separate thing, but as part of itself. The legacy of the river is this: that life spends itself completely, and in doing so, begins again.